Commander Zex-Hi had seen war before, and he thought he knew everything about it. For 40 years, he had watched different alien races fight each other across the galaxy. He worked for the Galactic Council as someone who studied how wars happened, and why they ended the way they did. His job was simple: watch the fighting, record what happened, and write reports about it. He had filled thousands of files with information about battles between the Krell Empire and the Zephyrian Federation, watched the Silicon Wars tear apart 3 star systems, and documented the final defeat of the Void Hunters in the Outer Rim. War always followed the same patterns, and Zex-Hi could predict how most conflicts would end just by looking at the numbers. The rules were always the same across every species. Bigger fleets usually won against smaller ones. Better technology beat older weapons. More resources meant longer wars and better chances of winning. Smarter tactics could help weaker forces survive longer, but they rarely changed the final outcome. Most importantly, every intelligent species understood that war was expensive and dangerous. They fought for clear reasons like territory, resources, trade routes, or political power. When the cost became too high, they would negotiate and find some compromise. This was how civilized beings handled conflict. Then the humans appeared, and Zex-Hi first heard about them in a routine briefing about new species discovered in the outer territories. The report described them as unremarkable bipeds from a small blue planet called Earth. They had recently developed faster than light, travel, and were beginning to establish colonies in nearby star systems. Their technology was primitive compared to most galactic civilizations. They used chemical rockets, kinetic weapons, and basic fusion drives. Their ships were made of simple metal alloys, and their computers were laughably slow. The intelligence. Analysts predicted they would need at least 500 years to become a significant power in galactic politics. Zex-Hi barely paid attention to the human file. New species were discovered regularly, and most of them followed predictable development patterns. The humans seemed especially boring because they were so far behind technologically. Their weapons were crude, their ships were slow, and their military organization appeared chaotic compared to the precise hierarchies of established galactic powers. He filed the report away and forgot about them completely. 3 months later, everything changed. The first human colony ship called New Horizons was destroyed while traveling to a system near Proxima Centauri. The attackers were Kathmar raiders, cybernetic pirates who had been terrorizing merchant vessels for decades. They were known for their brutal tactics and their habit of taking no prisoners. The New Horizons carried 8,000 human colonists, including families with children. The Kathmar killed everyone aboard and stripped the ship for valuable materials before destroying the wreckage. Zex-Hi expected the human response to follow standard diplomatic protocols. Most civilized species would file formal complaints with the Galactic Council, demand compensation, and perhaps impose economic sanctions. Some might send a small military force to patrol their shipping lanes more carefully. The more aggressive, races might launch a limited strike against known pirate bases, but the response would be measured, proportional, and designed to prevent escalation. Instead, the human military issued a statement that made Zex-Hi pause and read it twice. Admiral Jake Morrison of the Human Defense Force spoke to news networks across human space with just 5 words that somehow carried more menace than the longest threats Zex-Hi had heard from warrior races like the Krell. Morrison looked directly into the cameras and said, "Find them, all of them." The tone was wrong. There was no anger in Morrison's voice, no shouting or dramatic gestures. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather. But something in his eyes reminded Zex-Hi of footage he had seen from volcanic worlds just before eruptions. The surface appeared calm, while enormous forces built. Pressure underneath. Human news networks began broadcasting information about the dead colonists. They showed pictures of families, read names of children, and interviewed relatives who described their hopes for new lives on distant worlds. Other species might have done this too, but humans did something different. They started making lists. Lists of names, lists of ages, lists of dreams that would never be fulfilled. They turned 8,000 dead people into 8,000 individual stories of loss. HFY found himself disturbed by the human reaction. Their military was mobilizing, but they were also doing something else, something he had never seen before. They were making the deaths personal for their entire species. Every human seemed to know the names of strangers who had died light years away. They spoke about the colonists as if they were family members. When he requested assignment to observe the upcoming conflict, his supervisors were puzzled. The humans had only a few dozen ships and limited military experience. The Kathmar had been raiding successfully for centuries and commanded hundreds of vessels with superior technology. It would be a short, one-sided massacre that would teach the humans about galactic realities. But HFY had seen something in Admiral Morrison's eyes that made him want to watch more carefully. He prepared his observation ship and set course for human space, expecting to document another predictable defeat. He had no idea that he was about to witness something that would change his understanding of war forever. 3 months passed before the humans made their move, and HFY began to think they had decided to avoid conflict entirely. Many species chose this path when faced with superior enemies. It was the smart choice, the logical choice, the choice that preserved lives and resources for future opportunities. But then his sensors detected human ships moving toward Kathmar territory, and he realized they had not been hiding. They had been preparing. Captain Lisa Rodriguez commanded the lead vessel, a modified cargo ship called Defiant that had been hastily converted for military use. 2 smaller escort frigates flanked her position, their hulls bearing fresh welding marks where additional armor plating had been attached. The human fleet looked pitiful compared to typical military formations. Their ships were mismatched, their formations loose, and their equipment clearly improvised. HFY positioned his observation cruiser at a safe distance and activated his recording systems, expecting to document a brief and tragic example of inexperienced warriors learning hard lessons. The Kathmar controlled a region of space filled with asteroid fields and abandoned mining stations. They used these locations as bases for their raiding operations, hiding among the rocks and striking at passing merchant vessels. Their main stronghold was a massive fortress called Fang Outpost, built into a hollowed-out asteroid and bristling with plasma cannons. Over 10,000 Kathmar warriors lived there, cybernetic beings who had replaced most of their organic parts with mechanical weapons and armor. They had successfully defended their territory against numerous attempts by galactic authorities to dislodge them. Rodriguez and her small fleet approached the outer edge of Kathmar space and immediately began doing things that made no sense, according to standard military doctrine. Instead of broadcasting identification signals and demanding safe passage, they transmitted distress calls claiming their engines had failed. They used old human entertainment broadcasts as background noise, creating the impression of a damaged civilian vessel trying to call for help. When Kathmar patrol ships moved to investigate, the humans waited until the pirates were close before revealing their true nature. The first engagement lasted only minutes, but it violated every principle of honorable combat that HFY had learned. During his decades of military observation, the human escort frigates had been hiding in the cargo ship's sensor shadow, invisible until they suddenly accelerated and opened fire at point-blank range. But even more shocking was what happened when one of the escort ships took critical damage to its reactor core. Instead of ejecting the damaged section or attempting repairs, the human crew deliberately overloaded the reactor and rammed their ship directly into the nearest Kathmar vessel. HFY watched the collision through his observation cameras and heard something that chilled his translator systems. As their ship exploded, the human crew was screaming words that roughly translated to battle cries, but the emotional intensity behind them was unlike anything in his experience. They were not shouting from fear or desperation. They were expressing pure, focused rage, as if the act of dying while killing their enemies filled them with satisfaction rather than terror. The surviving Kathmar ships retreated to report this encounter to their commanders, but the humans followed them. Rodriguez had somehow acquired detailed intelligence about Kathmar patrol routes and base locations. Her ships moved through the asteroid fields with confidence, avoiding sensor nets and weapon emplacements that should have been unknown to them. When HFY analyzed their navigation patterns, he realized the humans had been studying their enemies for months, mapping every installation and memorizing every defensive position. More human ships arrived over the following weeks, but they were not traditional military vessels. Converted civilian craft joined the growing fleet, their cargo holds filled with improvised weapons and volunteer crews who had no formal military training. Miners brought ships equipped with industrial cutting lasers. Transport captains carried loads of explosives instead of commercial goods. Even passenger liners had been modified to carry fighters and assault troops. The entire human-civilian fleet seemed to be transforming itself into a weapon of war. What disturbed HFY most was the way humans fought when they were outnumbered or outgunned. Other species would retreat, regroup, and wait for reinforcements, or better circumstances. Humans did the opposite. When 3 human fighters encountered a Kathmar destroyer, they attacked immediately without calling for support. When their weapons proved ineffective against the destroyer's armor, they used their ships as missiles, ramming the larger vessel until its hull cracked and atmosphere began venting into space. The tactical recordings showed human faces during these combat encounters, and HFY found them deeply unsettling. He had observed many warrior species during battle, and they typically displayed either cold professionalism or hot-blooded excitement. Humans showed something different entirely. Their expressions revealed a burning anger that seemed to fuel impossible acts of heroism and self-sacrifice. They spoke constantly about the dead colonists from New Horizons, repeating names and ages as if the memory of those deaths gave them strength. Lieutenant Jerry Walsh led a boarding party that captured a Kathmar supply depot by fighting room to room through corridors filled with automated defense systems. His team took 70% casualties but refused to retreat even when their ammunition ran low. They used improvised weapons, tools torn from the station's machinery, and their own hands when necessary. The few surviving Kathmar defenders surrendered not because they were defeated, but because they were terrified by the humans' refusal to stop fighting even when victory seemed impossible. Captain Rodriguez began broadcasting messages on all frequencies, speaking directly to Kathmar commanders throughout their territory. She did not threaten them with destruction or demand their surrender. Instead, she simply read the names of the colonists who had died aboard New Horizons. 8,000 names, read slowly and clearly, with brief descriptions of their ages, occupations, and dreams for the future. The broadcasts continued for hours each day, turning the dead humans into individual people rather than anonymous statistics. HFY realized that something fundamental was happening that his training had not prepared him for. The humans were not fighting a war in any conventional sense. They were expressing something primal and terrifying that other species had evolved beyond or learned to control. Their anger was not a tactical choice, but a force of nature, like gravity or radiation, that could not be reasoned with or redirected once it had been awakened. As he updated his preliminary reports, HFY found himself struggling to describe what he was witnessing. The humans had no superior technology, no tactical advantages, no strategic resources that explained their effectiveness against a stronger enemy. What they possessed was something far more dangerous and far more alien than any weapon system he had ever encountered. The human campaign intensified beyond all rational boundaries as more ships arrived from Earth and the colony worlds. What had begun as a small punitive expedition was becoming something else entirely, something that made HFY question his understanding of how civilized species conducted warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Ben Carter commanded the Marine forces that had joined Rodriguez's fleet, and his methods violated every principle of proportional response that governed galactic military doctrine. Carter's Marines fought differently than any soldiers Zexhai had observed during his 4 decades of documenting interstellar conflicts. When they boarded Kathmar vessels, they did not follow standard procedures for ship-to-ship combat. Instead of securing key areas like the bridge and engineering sections, they systematically cleared every compartment, every corridor, every storage room until no enemy remained alive. They fought room by room through ships that had already surrendered, refusing to accept anything less than complete elimination of all opposition. The tactical recordings from these boarding actions revealed disturbing patterns. Human Marines would continue fighting even after taking wounds that should have incapacitated them. Sergeant Danny Ross led his squad through a Kathmar cruiser despite having lost his left arm to plasma fire. He used a combat knife with his remaining hand and improvised weapons torn from the ship's equipment until he finally collapsed from blood loss. Before losing consciousness, he managed to seal the compartment containing the last group of enemy survivors and flood it with toxic gas from the ship's waste recycling system. What shocked Zexhai most was how the humans spoke during these battles. They maintained constant communication with each other, but instead of tactical updates or status reports, they talked about the dead colonists. They had memorized the names and personal details of all 8,000 victims from New Horizons. During firefights, they would call out information about specific families, describing children who would never grow up and parents who had dreamed of new lives among the stars. The memories seemed to fuel their determination and make them immune to fear or exhaustion. Private Kelly Martin fought her way through 3 decks of a Kathmar destroyer while carrying a wounded comrade on her back. When enemy fighters cornered them in a damaged corridor, she used grenades to collapse the ceiling and create a barrier, then spent 6 hours defending the position with limited ammunition. She survived by using pieces of debris as projectiles, and eventually fashioned crude spears from broken metal struts. When rescue teams finally reached her position, they found 17 dead Kathmar warriors and Martin still conscious despite having multiple fractures and severe burns. The humans had also begun using tactics that violated every convention of civilized warfare. Instead of engaging enemy vessels in honorable combat, they employed deception, sabotage, and psychological warfare designed to terrorize their opponents. Commander Scott Baker led a team that infiltrated a Kathmar mining operation by disguising their ship as a damaged freighter. Once inside the facility, they poisoned the water recycling systems, sabotaged life support equipment, and planted explosives throughout the structure before revealing their true identity. But the most disturbing aspect of human warfare was their treatment of prisoners and their response to enemy attempts at negotiation. When Kathmar commanders tried to arrange ceasefires or prisoner exchanges, the humans refused to acknowledge any communication that did not begin with full responsibility. For the New Horizons massacre, Commander Amy Patterson, who had taken over diplomatic functions for the fleet, would respond to peace overtures by broadcasting the final recordings from the colony ship, forcing enemy listeners to hear the voices of dying children and desperate parents. The humans had somehow obtained the complete passenger manifest from New Horizons and turned it into a weapon more effective than any plasma cannon or missile system. They transmitted detailed biographies of the victims across all communication frequencies, describing their hopes and dreams in excruciating detail. An 8-year-old girl named Lucy, who wanted to see alien animals. A retired teacher named Frank, who planned to start a school on the New World. A young couple named Chris and Maria, who were expecting their first child. The humans made sure their enemies knew exactly who they had killed and why their deaths demanded vengeance. Captain Rodriguez had established a pattern of attacks that seemed designed to cause maximum psychological damage rather than strategic advantage. Her fleet would strike isolated outposts and mining stations, eliminating every Kathmar present before broadcasting the names of colonists who had been avenged. The mathematical precision was disturbing. They appeared to be maintaining a careful count, ensuring that Kathmar deaths matched or exceeded the number of human casualties from the original attack. Zexhai observed a boarding action where Sergeant Tim Hayes and his squad captured a Kathmar communications station intact. Instead of destroying the facility or extracting intelligence, they used it to hack into the enemy's internal networks and broadcast images from New Horizons throughout Kathmar space. The footage showed families trying to escape as their ship burned, children crying in the corridors, and final messages that colonists had recorded for relatives back on Earth. The psychological impact was devastating. Several Kathmar bases reported mutinies and desertion as their warriors struggled to cope with the guilt and horror of seeing their victims as individual people rather than abstract enemies. The human campaign had evolved beyond simple revenge into something that resembled a surgical dismantling of enemy morale and capability. They struck with precision against targets that would cause maximum disruption to Kathmar operations while minimizing their own casualties. But they also seemed determined to ensure that every enemy warrior understood the personal cost of their previous actions. They were not simply fighting to win territory or resources. They were fighting to teach a lesson that would prevent future attacks against human civilians. Major Paul Clark commanded a unit that specialized in capturing Kathmar supply convoys intact. His teams would disable enemy ships without destroying them, then force the crews to listen to detailed accounts of life aboard New Horizons before the attack. They made the enemy understand that they had not simply destroyed a ship, but had murdered 8,000 individuals with names, families, and dreams. The psychological warfare was more effective than conventional weapons because it attacked the fundamental assumptions that allowed warriors to function in combat. As Zexhai compiled his observations, he realized that the humans had transformed from victims into something far more dangerous. They no longer fought for survival or territorial gain. They fought to ensure that the universe understood the consequences of threatening human civilians. Their anger had become a weapon more terrible than any technology, and it showed no signs of diminishing as the campaign continued to escalate. Major Rick Sullivan's assault on Bloodfang Outpost shattered every assumption Zexhai held about human military limitations and forced him to confront the terrifying reality of what happened when humans stopped restraining themselves. The fortress had withstood attacks by 3 different galactic powers over the past century, its massive shields and asteroid armor providing protection that conventional weapons could not penetrate. Military analysts estimated that a proper siege would require at least 50 capital ships and several months of sustained bombardment. The humans arrived with 12 converted civilian vessels and finished the job in 6 hours. Sullivan had spent weeks studying the station's defenses and discovered something that traditional military commanders had overlooked: Bloodfang Outpost depended on a network of automated mining platforms that harvested metals from nearby asteroids to maintain and expand the fortress. The humans did not attack the station directly. Instead, they hijacked the mining equipment and turned it into the most devastating weapon system Zexhai had ever witnessed. The mining platforms used powerful tractors and mass drivers to move asteroids weighing millions of tons. Sullivan's engineers, led by a former civilian contractor named Pete Williams, reprogrammed the automated systems to accelerate selected rocks to significant fractions of light speed before hurling them at the fortress. The kinetic energy released by these impacts exceeded anything that conventional weapons could deliver. Each strike sent shockwaves through the asteroid that housed the station, cracking the bedrock and causing progressive structural failures throughout the complex. But the humans did not simply bombard the station until it surrendered. They calculated exactly how much damage was needed to collapse the shields without destroying the station entirely because they wanted prisoners. They wanted survivors who could spread word of what happened to those who attacked human civilians. The asteroid bombardment continued for exactly 47 minutes, each impact precisely timed and targeted to create maximum psychological impact while preserving the possibility of ground assault. When the shields finally failed, the human ground forces moved with a coordination that defied their apparent lack of military experience. Sergeant Kelly Brooks led her squad through the station's lower levels, where artificial gravity had been damaged by the bombardment. The shifting gravitational fields created a three-dimensional battlefield, where up and down changed randomly, making traditional combat tactics impossible. But humans adapted instantly, using magnetic boots and improvised zip lines to navigate environments that left their enemies helpless. The Kathmar had evolved on high-gravity worlds, and their cybernetic enhancements were designed for combat in stable gravitational fields. When the station's gravity generators began fluctuating wildly, they found themselves unable to maintain orientation or coordinate their movements. Human soldiers, accustomed to working in the variable gravity of space stations and mining facilities, used these conditions to their advantage. They fought battles on walls and ceilings, attacking from angles that Kathmar warriors could not defend against. Zexhi's combat cameras captured scenes that would disturb his sleep for years afterward. Corporal Jake Murphy continued fighting, after losing both legs to an explosive blast, using his hands to drag himself through corridors while firing improvised weapons at enemy positions. When his ammunition ran out, he used grenades to seal himself and 3 Kathmar warriors in a storage compartment, ensuring that none of them would escape to threaten other human soldiers. The humans had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit Kathmar psychology and physiology. They knew that cybernetic warriors depended on their mechanical parts for combat effectiveness, so they targeted these systems with electromagnetic pulse weapons that disabled enemy enhancements. Without killing them immediately, Kathmar fighters who had relied on artificial limbs and sensory implants found themselves suddenly blind, deaf, and crippled, forced to confront their organic limitations while human soldiers advanced through the smoke and chaos. Colonel Tony Martinez commanded the assault on the station's central command center, where the most heavily defended Kathmar positions protected their leadership and critical systems. His troops encountered resistance that should have stopped any conventional attack, but humans had brought weapons and tactics that no sane military planner would have approved. When plasma barriers blocked their advance, Martinez ordered his demolition specialists to plant explosives throughout the surrounding structure, bringing down entire sections of the station to create new routes of attack. The most shocking moment came when Martinez found himself trapped in the command center, with 12 enemy warriors and no way to retreat. Rather than surrender or attempt to negotiate, he activated demolition charges while still inside the blast radius, ensuring that the Kathmar commanders would die even if he could not survive to see their defeat. The explosion collapsed 3 levels of the station and eliminated the entire enemy leadership structure. Human soldiers found Martinez's body hours later, still holding the detonator that had completed his mission. Lieutenant Sarah Jones led a unit that cleared the stations, medical facilities where wounded Kathmar warriors had retreated for treatment. Instead of executing helpless enemies, she forced them to watch footage from New Horizons while human medics treated their injuries. The psychological impact was devastating. Many of the wounded warriors broke down completely when confronted, with images of the children they had killed. Some begged for death, rather than continue living with the knowledge of their crimes. The humans had systematically eliminated every Kathmar on the station, except for a carefully selected group of survivors. These prisoners were not tortured or executed. Instead, they were forced to memorize the names and personal details of every colonist who had died aboard New Horizons. Human guards would quiz them regularly, ensuring they could recite the information perfectly before allowing them to eat or sleep. The psychological conditioning was more effective than any physical punishment because it forced the enemy to confront the individual humanity of their victims. Captain Dave Roberts commanded the final sweep through the station's outer sections, where automated defenses and booby traps posed continuing threats to human forces. His teams moved methodically through areas that had been abandoned by the enemy, disabling weapons systems and clearing explosive devices. They documented everything they found, creating detailed records of Kathmar capabilities and tactics that would be useful for future operations against other pirate groups. The assault on Bloodfang Outpost lasted exactly 6 hours and 17 minutes from the first kinetic bombardment to the final surrender of enemy forces. Human casualties totaled 43 dead and 97 wounded, losses that any military commander would consider acceptable for such a significant victory. But HFY realized that the numbers did not capture the true significance of what had happened. The humans had not simply captured a fortress. They had demonstrated capabilities that would terrify every military planner in the galaxy once word of their methods spread beyond classified intelligence reports. As he watched soldiers secure the station and begin interrogating prisoners, HFY understood that he was witnessing the emergence of a new type of warfare that other species were not prepared to face. The humans possessed no superior technology or advanced weapons that explained their success. What they possessed was something far more dangerous: the willingness to transform themselves into weapons when those they loved were threatened. The final phase of the human campaign began when Admiral Jake Morrison arrived with the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled, 60 ships that represented every vessel they could spare from defense duties and civilian operations. Most were converted cargo haulers, passenger liners, and industrial ships that had been hastily fitted with weapons and armor plating. The flagship Retribution had been a luxury cruise vessel before the war, its elegant dining halls and entertainment decks, now filled with Marines and military equipment. Captain Steve Roberts commanded this improvised warship with the same quiet determination that had characterized human leadership throughout the campaign. Morrison's target was not another outpost or supply depot, but the Kathmar homeworld itself, a massive planet that housed over 2 billion cybernetic warriors and their families. No military force in galactic history had attempted such an ambitious operation against an established civilization. Even the great empire wars that had shaped galactic politics involved gradual conquest of territory rather than direct assault on heavily defended home systems. But humans operated by different rules, and their concept of proportional response seemed to escalate without limits once they decided their enemies deserved punishment. HFY followed the human fleet as it approached Kathmar Prime, expecting to witness either a glorious victory or a catastrophic defeat that would end human expansion into galactic affairs permanently. Instead, he observed something that defied all military logic and challenged his understanding of how civilized beings conducted warfare. The humans did not seek quick victory through overwhelming force or negotiated settlement through diplomatic pressure. They wanted the entire Kathmar species to understand the consequences of attacking human civilians, and they were prepared to spend months teaching that lesson, regardless of cost. The siege began with systematic destruction of orbital infrastructure that had taken the Kathmar centuries to construct. Commander Nancy White led bomber squadrons that targeted space elevators, communication satellites, defense platforms, and industrial facilities with surgical precision. Each attack was carefully planned to maximize strategic damage while minimizing civilian casualties, but the cumulative effect was devastating. Within 2 weeks, the Kathmar had lost their ability to communicate with other worlds, transport goods to orbital markets, or defend against further attacks. But destruction of military capabilities was only the beginning of the human campaign. Morrison had brought broadcasting equipment that could override planetary communication systems and transmit signals directly to every receiver on the planet's surface. For 12 hours each day, human voices read the names and personal details of colonists who had died aboard New Horizons. The broadcasts included photographs, family histories, and recordings of final messages that victims had made for relatives back on Earth. Every Kathmar on the planet was forced to confront the individual humanity of the people they had murdered. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Turner commanded ground forces that established bases on Kathmar Prime's 3 moons, positions that allowed them to monitor all traffic entering or leaving the system. His troops intercepted supply convoys and refugee ships attempting to evacuate important personnel, forcing them to return to the planet's surface. No one was allowed to escape until the lesson had been learned completely. The humans were prepared to maintain their siege indefinitely, using their converted civilian vessels to supply their forces while the enemy planet slowly starved. The psychological warfare continued to escalate as human intelligence teams gathered more information about Kathmar society and culture. They discovered that cybernetic warriors maintained detailed records of their raids and conquests, treating the destruction of merchant vessels and passenger ships as achievements worthy of celebration. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, who had been promoted to handle information operations, began broadcasting these records alongside footage from New Horizons, forcing the planet's population to see the connection between their cultural heroes and the murder of innocent families. Major Tom Bradley led Special Forces teams that infiltrated the planet's surface to plant transmitters and gather intelligence about enemy capabilities and morale. His soldiers moved through Kathmar cities wearing captured enemy equipment, documenting the impact of the siege on civilian populations. They reported that many young Kathmar were questioning the warrior culture that had defined their species for millennia, especially after learning the details of what their heroes had done to human children. The siege entered its third month, with no sign that either side was prepared to compromise. Human forces had completely isolated Kathmar Prime from the rest of the galaxy, while maintaining constant pressure on military installations and government facilities. They demonstrated their ability to strike any target on the planet's surface by occasionally destroying symbolic buildings or monuments that celebrated past raids against other species. Each attack was precisely timed and executed, proving that human forces could eliminate any objective they chose while the enemy remained, helpless to prevent further damage. Admiral Morrison's strategy became clear as the siege continued. He was not simply trying to defeat the Kathmar military or force their government to surrender. He wanted to fundamentally change their society by making them confront the moral consequences of their actions. The daily broadcasts had begun to include messages from families of victims, describing the grief and loss that Kathmar raids had caused across dozens of worlds and hundreds of species. The psychological impact was devastating, because it forced a warrior culture to see themselves as murderers of innocents rather than heroes of conquest. Commander Bob Wilson led the naval blockade that prevented any ships from reaching Kathmar Prime with supplies or reinforcements. His converted cargo vessels patrolled the system's outer edges, intercepting military convoys and forcing them to retreat or face destruction. The blockade was so effective that orbital manufacturing facilities began shutting down due to lack of raw materials, while ground-based industries struggled to operate without components that could only be produced in space-based factories. The most disturbing aspect of the siege was how thoroughly the humans had prepared for extended operations. They had brought enough supplies to maintain their forces for over a year, along with industrial equipment that allowed them to manufacture ammunition and replacement parts using asteroids and captured enemy materials. Captain Jennifer Walsh commanded engineering teams that established mining operations on nearby asteroids, creating a self-sufficient supply chain that made the human fleet independent of support from Earth. As the siege entered its fourth month, Kathmar leaders finally attempted to negotiate a surrender. They offered to pay reparations for the destruction of New Horizons, withdraw from contested territories, and submit to galactic authorities for trial. The proposal included everything that traditional military doctrine suggested would be reasonable terms for ending the conflict. Admiral Morrison's response shocked even Zexhai, who thought he had begun to understand human psychology after months of observation. Morrison transmitted a brief message that was broadcast simultaneously to Kathmar Prime and every major world in the galaxy. His voice remained calm and conversational, the same tone he had used when first learning about the colony ship attack. He looked directly into the camera and spoke words that would be remembered by military historians for centuries. Surrender was an option 3 months ago. Now you face judgment. The human fleet began preparing for the final phase of their campaign, operations that would determine whether the Kathmar species would survive as anything more than a cautionary tale about the consequences of threatening human civilians. The human fleet departed Kathmar space exactly 6 months after Admiral Morrison had first spoken those 5 chilling words that began their campaign of vengeance. HFY watched their ships disappear into hyperspace and tried to comprehend what he had witnessed during the longest and most disturbing military observation of his career. Behind them, they left a world that had been reduced to pre-industrial technology, its population struggling to survive without the orbital infrastructure and interstellar trade networks that had supported their civilization for over 1,000 years. The once mighty Kathmar warrior clans had been systematically dismantled through a combination of military precision and psychological warfare that no galactic power had ever employed against an entire species. Their space navy had been destroyed or captured, their industrial capacity eliminated, and their cultural identity shattered by months of forced confrontation with the moral consequences of their actions. The survivors would spend generations rebuilding what humans had torn down in half a year, and they would do so while carrying the knowledge that their ancestors had murdered 8,000 innocent people whose names they could now recite from memory. HFY began the long journey, back to Galactic Council headquarters with recordings and documentation that filled hundreds of data storage units. He had captured every significant engagement, recorded thousands of hours of tactical communications, and compiled detailed analyses of human military capabilities and psychological profiles. But as he reviewed the material during his return voyage, he found himself unable to summarize what he had truly witnessed in terms that other military analysts would understand or accept. His fellow council members would read his report and focus on the innovative tactics that humans had employed, noting their creative use of converted civilian vessels, improvised weapons, and unconventional strategies that had overcome superior enemy technology. They would praise human adaptation and recommend further study of their methods for possible incorporation into standard military doctrine. They would completely miss the deeper truth that HFY had observed during those terrifying months in human space. The humans had not simply waged war against the Kathmar. They had channeled something primal and alien that other species had, evolved beyond or learned to suppress through millions of years of civilization. Their fury was not a tactical choice that could be replicated through training or doctrine. It was a fundamental force of nature that existed within human psychology, dormant until awakened by the right circumstances, then burning with intensity that could not be controlled or redirected until it had consumed everything that threatened their loved ones. HFY had watched human soldiers fight with wounds that should have killed them, seen families volunteer for suicide missions without hesitation, and observed entire civilian populations transform themselves into weapons of war when their children were threatened. This was not learned behavior or cultural conditioning. This was something written into human genetic code, a survival mechanism that had allowed their species to climb to the top of their planet's food chain despite lacking natural weapons or armor. The most disturbing realization came when HFY reviewed recordings of human faces during combat. He had expected to see fear, excitement, or professional determination like other warrior species displayed in battle. Instead, he found expressions of pure, focused rage that seemed to provide energy rather than drain it. Humans became more effective fighters as their anger increased, not less controlled or rational. They planned better, fought harder, and accepted greater risks when motivated by fury over threats to their families and communities. Captain Steve Roberts had demonstrated this phenomenon during the final assault on Kathmar government facilities, leading his converted cruise ship directly into the teeth of planetary defense systems while broadcasting recordings of children's voices from New Horizons. His tactical decisions became more creative and effective as the battle intensified, not more reckless or emotional. The human capacity for controlled rage allowed them to maintain strategic thinking while unleashing devastating levels of aggression against their enemies. HFY submitted his preliminary report to the Galactic Council, but requested additional time to complete his analysis of human military psychology. He needed to understand whether what he had observed represented typical human behavior or an extreme response to exceptional circumstances. The answer would determine how other species should interact with humanity as they expanded into galactic civilization and encountered the inevitable conflicts that arose between different cultures and economic interests. But his superiors had already made their decision about the human threat level. The report was immediately classified at the highest levels of Council security, with access restricted to senior military commanders and intelligence analysts. The official explanation stated that human tactical innovations required careful study before being released to prevent enemy species from developing countermeasures. The real reason was that Council leadership recognized the dangerous implications of human military capabilities and wanted to control how that information was shared with other galactic powers. Word spread quietly through military channels despite official secrecy, carried by commanders who had reviewed classified summaries of the Kathmar campaign. The message was simple and consistent across all species and military organizations. Leave the humans alone, treat their civilians with respect, and never give them a reason to show what they were truly capable of when they stopped holding back. The informal warnings were more effective than any formal treaty or diplomatic agreement because they came from experienced warriors who understood the practical implications of human military doctrine. HFY spent months writing his final report, struggling to convey the reality of human warfare in terms that other species could comprehend without triggering panic across galactic civilization. He documented their tactical innovations and strategic thinking while carefully avoiding detailed descriptions of their psychological state during combat operations. He wanted to warn other military planners about human capabilities without starting an arms race or preemptive war that could devastate multiple star systems. His conclusion summarized everything he had learned during those 6 months of observation. Humanity possesses no superior technology, no advanced weaponry, no tactical advantages that explain their victory over the Kathmar. What they possess is something far more dangerous than any weapon system: the willingness to transform themselves into instruments of vengeance when those they love are threatened. War was familiar to me until I confronted human fury head-on. Now, I understand that we have been playing at warfare while humans have been preparing for it their entire evolutionary history. The report was distributed to fewer than 50 individuals across the entire galaxy, each of whom signed agreements that restricted their ability to share the information with subordinates or allies. But the lessons of the Kathmar campaign continued to spread through unofficial channels, carried by merchants who had witnessed human military operations and diplomats who had observed human responses to various crises. The galaxy was learning to approach humanity with a mixture of respect and caution that no other species had ever commanded so quickly after making first contact. HFY returned to his normal duties as a military observer but found himself unable to view other conflicts with the same analytical detachment he had maintained throughout his career. He had seen what happened when a species developed the capacity for unlimited escalation in defense of their families, and he understood that the galaxy was no longer the same place it had been before humans arrived to demonstrate new possibilities for warfare and vengeance.